Good evening. And welcome to Q&A live from the Edge Theatre in Melbourne. I'm Tony Jones, answering your questions tonight in this special Melbourne Writers' Festival edition of Q&A. Free marketeer and columnist Chris Berg, the editor of Breakfast Politics and a biographer of Julia Gillard, Christine Wallace, former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, Prime Ministerial daughter and author of Campaign Ruby, Jessica Rudd, and the author of The Life and Death of Democracy, John Keane. Please welcome our panellists. Okay, Q&A is live from 9:40 Eastern Time. You can send your questions by SMS to 1975522 or via our website, abc.net.au/Quanda, Q&A. And join the Twitter conversation using the Quanda hashtag that's on your screen at the moment. Well, with an audience of 300 literary lovers, a distinguished panel, and politics in limbo, there's a lot of questions to ask. Let's go to our very first one tonight, which comes from KASS HALL.
Australia's immediate political future is in the hands of three rural independents who are asking for a range of promises to be made without a mandate from the rest of Australia. Their motives are clearly to protect. Is it time for both sides of the political spectrum to take the hard decision to go back to the polls and ask for a mandate to govern from the Australian people?
Okay, we had a few sound problems there, but is it time? Essentially, Australia's political future is in the hands of three rural independents. They've got a range of promises. They don't have a mandate from the rest of Australia. They're clearly trying to protect their own interests. Is it time for both sides of the political spectrum to take the hard decision and go back to the polls and ask for a mandate to govern from the Australian people? Malcolm Fraser, is it time to go back to the polls?
No, not yet. It may be possible to form a stable government, although the problems in front of that, I think, are very great. We don't know what the so-called demands of the rural independents are. They seem to have a fairly diverse agenda. And there's also, it hasn't had all that much publicity perhaps, but the complexity that whatever government is established, if one is established, the Greens will be in charge of the Senate from next July. So you can have something that might work till July, but will it work after July? We just don't know what the demands are, and I think it's quite impossible to make firm, sensible judgments yet.
You've heard Andrew Wilkie, the other independent, say that they're behaving like a political party with three factions. I mean, can you make a deal under those circumstances?
Well, it'll be difficult. I mean, the Italians have tried to do this, and you could say in some sense that Italy has been a very successful country without a government for over 50 years. They've got a good reserve bank, really solid, and their economic performance, ever since the Second World War, which was mostly before you were born, certainly probably a lot of you born after I left the Parliament, Italy's economic performance, design performance, production performance, productivity has been way ahead of Britain's. Most people would say Britain's had a good government and Italy has not.
Okay, well, let's go to Jessica Rudd now. Apparently we don't need government, according to Malcolm Fraser, that's unified. What do you think? Is it time to go back to the polls?
Well, I think that the fact that we don't have people protesting in the streets, despite the fact that we don't have a government, means that most Australians are probably thinking to themselves, go to your room, sort it out, guys, you know. We're just a bit over having elections at the moment. And I think these independents are cool people. I've been listening to what a number of them have had to say, and I think we're in pretty safe hands. Bob Catter certainly had the best ad of the entire election campaign, so...
Yes, indeed he does. Jessica, the last part of the question, though, is it time to go back to the polls for a mandate to govern? What do you think about that?
I don't think so yet. I mean, I think that we need to give these people a chance to get their house in order, so to speak.
Okay, they're about to buzz us in a helicopter, but Chris Berg, assuming they don't come too low, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one thing we may learn out of this hung parliament is just how good it can be without a government for some time. In Belgium, they had a hung parliament for something like 8 months, and the government just keeps working. The government, we still have a government, and we still have a prime minister to make, you know, foreign policy decisions and national security decisions, all these sorts of things. But they can't stuff it up. They can't make the country much better. but they can't damage it in any way. And if you guys were happy with the election promises on the table this election, then, well, maybe you do want a government. But if you were dissatisfied with them, then this is probably not a bad place for us to be in.
Christine.
There's one big thing that's kind of gone unrecognised with this election, and that is that probably historically the best prediction of election outcomes is who people think is going to win. And overwhelmingly, all the quality polling showed and all the betting markets showed right up to election day that people overwhelmingly expected a Gillard government to be returned. Now, I think that kind of freed up people to poll protest votes at a rate that, you know, was pretty much unprecedented. And I think many of the people who did it did not expect even remotely the possibility of an Abbott government. And I think, in fact, this is the strongest argument for an early return to the polls, that I think if you had an election today, the protest vote level would be so much lower because of that, and I think Julia Gillard would be fairly comfortably returned.
We just heard Tony Abbott buzzing us in the helicopter there. He obviously didn't like what you're saying. Let's hear from John Keane. What do you think, John?
Well, it's day 9 in the big Australia election house. And, you know, the cheeky cheerfulness of Australians has kicked in. And I think millions of people are actually enjoying this interregnum. We have, I mean, what a show. Big Bob Kennedy Catter. We have a New Englander named Tony Windsor who says that he's proud of escaping 2 cancers recently, giving up smoking and abandoning the Nationals. And there is even a dissident National from the seat of O'Connor in Western Australia, about whom there's not been much discussion. A man who says he's going to sit on the crossbenches and unhappily is named Tony Crook. And I hear in Sydney lots of jokes going on about Wingnut, that's Tony Abbott, and I hear comments about Julia Gillard's inability to pronounce Mr. Rabbit in any other way than that. But there is a serious side. I agree very much with Christine that this is a period in which I would say we're all living in suspended animation, and in a way Australia is conducting its own election monitoring exercise. We've learned what a staged, managed, issueless election can lead to. We see finally that federal politics has joined the Brits and the Canadians and New Zealand in a hung parliament. I think it's clear that there are some things that are not good in the system, and I think we're beginning to see that some reforms are necessary. So it's not bad that it goes on for probably another week.
John, you missed one other indication of just how hard this is going to be, getting the independents on side. Bob Catter said today, we won't be drawing any lines in the sand, but we will be indicating where the lines in the sand are going to be drawn.
Let's go. Well, that's probably in advance from talking about the price of milk as a condition of a national government.
All right, let's go to second question of the night. It comes from Bill McIntosh.
The coalition has the highest primary vote, and Labor has the highest two-party preferred vote. Given the same number of seats, which party should be given the first opportunity to form government with the independents?
Malcolm Fraser, do you want to start us off there? It's a constitutional issue.
The two-party preferred vote, there have often been governments that have not had a majority of the two-party preferred vote or a majority of the primary vote. And it is the number of seats that actually count. If the seats are equal, convention suggests very strongly that the incumbent would be given the first chance to form a government. And if the incumbent can't, then that's where the Governor-General, or in Britain the monarch, would look around to see who else is offering, willing and able to try.
Malcolm, I've got to ask, how do you work out the count? Because at 73, the coalition has to rely on an independent national from Western Australia who wants to sit on the crossbenches. And at 73, Labor could say they have a Green MP on their side. So that could be 73 all, if you look at it that way.
Well, if it's 73 all, then Labor should be given the first chance to form a government.
Would you accept 73 all under those circumstances? It's obviously you have to add a Green on one side and an independent national on the other.
You might need to have some discussions with the Green and the independent national, how independent is this national? Is he really going to be on the crossbenches? Is he going to be a quasi-national? I think there's a lot that we still don't know.
I think you're right about that. Christine Wallace.
Well, whoever forms government, whomever gets to do it, and yes, you're quite right, Malcolm, probably Julia Gillard will get the first opportunity to do that. But you've got to ask yourself whether this is one of those horrible elections, much like Barack Obama faced. It could be the election that's good not to win. Whoever forms government is going to face the horrendous situation of being perpetually hostage to the whims of unpredictable independent candidates. And look, Bob Katter is a terrific bloke. 97% of the time, 3% of the time, well, you know, he's a firecracker. If Tony Abbott or Julia Gillard's future rests on the stability of support from that bunch of independents, I think we're in for a very interesting time. And, you know, boy, I'd be putting $1,000 on an election sooner or later, whomever gets to form government in the next few weeks.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because that's why the independents are emphasising we want whichever government we choose to put into power, we want them to stay the full 3 years. Because if they don't get that guarantee, as far as there can be a guarantee, then it's going to fall apart pretty quickly the moment whoever is holding the balance of power, Bob Katter or something like that, comes up with a proposal that the party just cannot agree to. By getting that guarantee that that the party will last the full term, or with the same leader will last the full term, they're locking in 3 years of potential pork barrelling and dodgy electorate deals for themselves.
Just come back to the question, though. Who do you think gets the first chance to form government? Do you accept the figures of being roughly 73 all? Or?
Yeah, sure. But no one gets a first chance to form government. It's whoever can hold power in the House. And for as long as they can. I don't think there's any... we've talked a lot about who won the two-party preferred and those sorts of figures. I don't think that gives a party any moral right to govern. It's whoever can hold power on the House. That's how the system works. It doesn't have any particular moral value other than that.
John Keane, you've watched elections now in two countries in a very short time, Britain and here. I mean, what do you think of this kind of hair-splitting exercise?
Well, I have a different view, I think, about hung parliaments and the possibility of minority governments. In Australian history, until 1910, we were governed under hung parliament conditions. We had the first Labour government, national Labour government in the world in 1904, a half Chilean Australian. We had arguably the most successful and most popular government, John Curtin, during World War II, on that basis, who went on to win a thumping majority, I think, in 1943. And we have local state examples. Every state has had an experience of this. Steve Bracks, at the end of the 90s, struck a charter of good governance and actually introduced some really important legislation. High-speed rail, a religious and racial toleration act, and went on to actually get rid of the three independents upon whom he depended, and won a very substantial majority. Actually, the experience around the world is this is a pretty normal situation. So I think, of course, much depends on what happens this week. It would be daft to form a government, to go to the House of Representatives to try to win the right to govern without a 3-year agreement and a very clear deal about the really substantial policies that will matter during the coming decade or two. Otherwise, we're all in trouble, and we will go back to the polls. And I can feel, from the grassroots that there is a lot of resistance to doing that. And I think it's a very dangerous path, and I hope both the independents and the two leaders of the two major parties understand that. Of course, the Greens are a key to the resolution of this.
Right, we'll come and talk more about them later. Jessica Rudd, what's your thought? Who should get the first opportunity under the circumstances outlined by the questioner to form government?
Well, I accept that the incumbent deserves to have that opportunity if it comes down to that. What an exciting few years it's going to be for you guys, Tony. I mean, covering that kind of a parliament will be so exciting. You never know what will happen every day.
But how many novels are there in it for you?
I know. What a great time to be a writer. Seriously. It's just going to be a fascinating few years.
Okay, let's go to our next question. It comes from ZOE Jones.
Mr. Fraser, what legacy does the dismissal of the Whitlam government have on today's parliamentary democracy? And in particular, what do you see as the role for the Governor-General in resolving the hung parliament?
The role of the Governor-General is largely governed by precedent. The incumbent, if the incumbent has an equal or more votes, not two-party preferred, but more seats than anyone else. If somebody else has more seats, they should get the first chance. Now, this is largely governed by practice and precedent in the past. Not only our past, but British past also. 1975 doesn't have any relationship to it at all. Different circumstances, different times. I suspect before you were born, and nobody wants to relive that. 5 years, 10 years, 15, 25, 30, 35, every anniversary.
Hang on for 1 second, we'll get a microphone too. Sorry about that.
The breaking of convention, but it wasn't breaking convention, because the convention that mattered was that if a government cannot get its money bills through the Parliament and cannot pay its bills, and the government couldn't do that, the Treasury had been required to construct phony certificates forcing the banks to pay their bills, which would have been totally illegal. If a government can't get its budget through, then that government either resigns or recommends that somebody else forms a government. And the one before that...
But they couldn't get it through because of you.
Of course, because of us. But if you can't get it through, there is no obligation on an opposition to support a budget in the circumstances that prevailed, and an overwhelming majority of Australians demonstrated that. All we were asking for was an election. And in the foreword to somebody's book, a British jurist, Lord Hailsham, wrote that Mr. Whitlam was rather a lucky man. All he did was lose an election. The previous person who tried to govern without the approval of Parliament, I always forget whether it was Charles I or II, but he lost his head.
Okay, Gough Whitlam, if you're listening out there, don't worry, it's too late to lose your head. This is Q&A, the live and interactive show. We're going to move on from history. I know you didn't want him to lose his head. We're going to allow other people to ask questions. Go to our website if you want to find out how to join the studio audience and ask a question like Matthew Lesh.
President Bartlett in the West Wing once said, "It's not our job to cater to the lowest common denominator. It's our job to raise it." Why is the opposite currently true within Australian politics?
Okay, in case anyone missed the beginning, President Bartlett in the West Wing once said, "It's not our job to cater to the lowest common denominator, it's our job to raise it." Why isn't that true in Australian politics? Jessica Rudd, you're a West Wing fan, I think.
I am a diehard West Wing fan, and I can think of nothing better to do, so I think that's an awesome question, Matthew. I think that we face a challenge in modern democracies, and that is about making sure that we are getting our messages across and getting them across clearly to everybody, but also politicians must step up to the task of saying what they believe. And that's a really difficult balance, because you need to be getting your message out there, and you need it to appeal to as many people as possible. And sometimes what you believe can slip. It happens in my book. There's a point at which the opposition leader is faced with a particularly difficult policy area, and he has to decide on whether he is going to pursue that his position, which I believe is the right position on immigration policy, or whether he is going to appeal to the lowest common denominator. He decides very strongly that he is going to go with his belief. That doesn't always happen.
Is it only in fiction that political leaders rise above the lowest common denominator?
Well, this is the beauty about the West Wing, isn't it, Matthew? And, you know, we sit there going, oh, if only President Bartlett was ours. You know, it's fantastic, fantastic viewing.
John Keane.
Well, I think Matthew's question is really critical, and I think it's one of the things we're thinking about on day 9 after this hung election. I would say that there are some structural reasons, to use professorial speak, for why you feel that, and you're not the only one. I think that politics in Australia, as in other democracies, has come to be governed by focus groups, by the concentration on marginals, by the throwing of media bombs, stop the boats, national tragedy of abortion. It has also come to be, I think, heavily dependent on absent voters. You know, we have 1.4 million estimated people, citizens, who are not actually registered and not voting. And when you add to this the cocooning that goes on in politics at the top and the loss of reality, you get this bizarre stage performance that, you know, most audiences would boo. I mean, I'm old enough to say that I was born in the year of Chifley's The Light on the Hill speech. You know, this election campaign, there was no light, it was all darkness, there were no hills, it was all on the flats.
John, I'm going to interrupt you because we've actually got another question before I bring the other panellists in to talk about this. Very similar question. It's from the audience, from Santa Pastricia.
We've just suffered an election where it seemed the entire message from both parties was directed to just a few 100,000 voters in New South Wales and Queensland. And the message seemed to assume that voters were predominantly xenophobic, selfish and disengaged. Now that both parties have lost their mandate and the fate of our parliament is in the hands of rural independents and minor parties who seem far more progressive and creative, my question is, how can voters encourage their politicians to catch up with their more creative views?
Malcolm Fraser. Interesting, isn't it, that that's the first question to get a spontaneous round of applause. It must be hitting a chord out there.
Well, I think it does hit a chord, and it's a very good thing that it does. But it's also important to look at what's wrong and what is not so wrong. Some people are starting to say, all right, we can fix some of this with some structural changes. Maybe the way Question Time works, maybe the way the Senate works, the relationships between the two. The sad thing about a democracy is that really good politicians can make a lousy system work extraordinarily well. And if the politicians, the people, are not adequate, they can destroy a really good system. I think Australia's probably got one of the dozen best democracies in the world in terms of structure and fabric. Sure, we can all think of some ways it might be improved. But the kinds of changes that I've seen talked about over the last few days aren't going to do anything to lead to better government. I mean, why wouldn't people talk about something that was important to the future of Australia? What influence do we want Australia to have? Do we continue to want Australia to behave like a puppy dog to America, or do we believe that Australia should have a sense of independence? Still keep ANZUS, we can do that, but we can still be independent and do some things in our own right. Important things were not discussed. It's the minutiae that were discussed that might be important to a particular region or a particular group of people. And that gets back to the people running our politics. Now, how does somebody like George Williams, the most eminent QC in Sydney, a very experienced lawyer, get beaten for pre-selection in the Labor Party by a staffer whom I must admit I don't know, by a junior staffer from somebody who was then in the opposition, front bench opposition.
You're talking about the dominance of the Labor Party machine in
well, it was the machine, but the Liberal Party machine is now exactly the same. If you look at the candidates who are chosen, they're mostly what I call apparatchiks. You go to university, you decide you want a political career. Now, which party should I join? Who do I know in this party? Who do I know in that party? Who's the most senior? Where can I get a job? Can I get a job back with the organisation? They've never done anything else. The Parliament needs people who've achieved something in their own right, who've done things in their own right, who know what the real world is, and who can contribute. Not people who will be beholden to a particular, more senior political benefactor or beholden to their head office.
Christine Wallace, I'll get you to bring in. There's a gentleman with his hand up down there. We'll get a microphone to you. We'll come to you in a moment. Hang on. Christine.
Look, there's a lot in what you say, Malcolm, but there's also an element of they were giants in our days, I think. There's a general feeling that this was just a disastrously high-carb election when people want a high-protein politics in Australia. And the symbol of that, I think, is what happened to climate change policy. The thing that really I do not understand about this election is why federal Labor, which is, a pretty brainy bunch of people, pretty professional machine behind it, did not satisfy the big yearning hunger for a serious, understandable, credible, meaty, effective climate change policy. Now, when you look at how Labor kind of has derailed over the last couple of years, it's because there was the biggest moral challenge of our time, then Copenhagen fell in a heap, then there was a 6-month interregnum, and then there was this basically a vacuum on climate change policy, late Rudd and through to Gillard. As a result, there's been this gigantic swing to the Greens, and there was credible polling out today showing that 1/3 of the people who voted Green this election, and there were over 1.15 million of them who voted Green, 1/3 of those people would have voted Labor had there been a credible climate policy. Now, you don't need to be a genius to work out if there'd been one, the Gillard government would have been comfortably returned.
But that means you need people who will stand for the issue, won't listen to the focus groups, will say, right, it'll be difficult to persuade Australians that this is the policy that Australia needs, but who will go there against the odds and change the focus groups around, change the polls around, simply because their arguments are on their side. And this has been done in the past in Australia.
I think we can overcomplicate it, and I think there's a big danger that the politicians have lost their ears, far from being too focus group driven. There's a big screaming message from this election for both sides of politics from voters. It's, we are unhappy with you. It is offer us better policies, and most of all, offer us something serious on climate change policy. It's not brain surgery.
Okay, I want to hear from Chris Berg, and then we'll go to that questioner who had his hand up a moment ago.
It was amazing how quickly things unravelled. Just in late 2009, we were watching the Liberal Party seemingly unravel and collapse into itself, and we were sure that Labor was going to cement its dominance for at least a decade. People were talking, I remember in late 2007 after the election, people were talking about, could this be the end of the Liberal Party? In 2009, they were saying, could the Liberal Party split? Could it all collapse? But it all fell apart just in a couple of months, really. As we say, it started with Copenhagen when Kevin Rudd failed to get the agreement that he was really relying on, and then probably failed to go to a double dissolution in January, February, and everybody lost their edge. But back in 2009, when the ETS was about to go to a vote, they were one vote off in the Liberal Party room from getting that policy passed. That would have gone through the Parliament. That would have been a massive success for Kevin Rudd and the Labor Party. And we wouldn't be talking as we do now. We wouldn't be talking as if, well, this is the end of Labor and this is the end of politics as we see it. I think we're reading too much meaning almost into the collapse of Labor and Liberal support in the last year.
All right. Advice for the Labor Party from where you least expect it. Let's hear from this questioner down here.
I wonder if the panel hasn't missed an important point in all this, which is that in the last 6 decades, only the Hawke Labor government managed to form a stable and working government. Isn't the true critique and the true lesson from this election that modern Labor is incapable of national leadership?
Let's hear from John Keane on that.
That, by the way, reminds me of Bob Hawke's favourite joke, which is the story of the terrible accident on the Hume Highway linking Melbourne and Sydney. 2 bodies mashed up, the forensics are called in. There are skid marks before one, and the forensics figure out that the skid marks of the kangaroo, the other figure was a politician. That was Bob Hawke's favourite joke. I'm not sure about that. I happen to think that Chris is wrong about this. I think this is a black swan moment in Australian politics. I think that we're at the end of the road of staged, managed two-party politics. It has collapsed in every other Westminster model. This is the last one where it has collapsed. And more than that, I think we are at the end of Labour-style politics, not only in machine terms, but I think the naive belief in progress, industrial progress, and the attachment to high-carbon industrial growth, I think that's coming to an end. And I think the Green vote, which Christine has rightly emphasised, is huge and potentially much bigger than the Democrats' vote, is the canary in the mineshaft, to mix metaphors. I think it's a sign of something, of a tectonic shift that's happening. And I would say that it's also putting on the agenda the need for big visions of Australia in the future. And it's either backward-looking or it's multicultural, within Asia, low carbon, a small player that's powerful in the world because of our ability to speak openly to our friends. That's a big vision that I think has been put on the table. We didn't hear anything of that during the election. That's the tragedy of it.
Okay. This is Q&A, the program that gives you the chance to ask the questions. The next question comes from Julia Henkel.
Jessica, your father's experienced the highs and lows of political life over a very short period of time. How has this affected you, your family and your father, and would you consider entering a politics life?
Well, it has been a tricky period for my family and I. I'm not going to deny that. It's been very difficult at times, but we're doing okay. I think worse things have happened to better people. And I'm sort of getting on with, I've written this book and I'm having a lot of fun talking about it. My mum's getting on with her business, my brothers are doing their own thing, Dad's got his own thing going, and we're doing fine. On me in politics? No, mate, not for me. I'm having a great time writing, and I hope to continue doing that.
We've just had a tweet come in while you were talking. Any chance your dad could become an independent?
You'd have to ask him about that, Tony. You can text him later, hey.
What would you advise him to do, Jessica?
No, my dad really believes in the Australian Labor Party, and I think given what's happened, that he still believes that is a mark of the man and a mark of the party.
Okay, we're going now to Chloe Sester-Jacobs.
My question's for Jessica as well. After the events of June 24, were you politically disillusioned leading up to the federal election? And do you believe that the results would have been different if Julia Gillard didn't take the Prime Ministership?
Look, I'm not disillusioned, actually. I'm a bit of an idealist. I feel like there is great hope for our young democracy. I think that there's a lot that we can do, and here we are in this situation where it's a pretty tight result, actually an exceptionally tight result. We don't have a result, do we? But that's okay. I think that what it means is that we all get a voice now. We all really get to participate. We have these strong independents with strong voices, and I think it's a good thing for us as a country.
What about the other half of that question? Do you think the result would have been different if Julia Gillard hadn't taken the Prime Ministership?
I don't know. I guess we'll never know the answer to that question, and I don't really believe in playing woulda, shoulda, coulda. I'm all into moving forward.
Okay, nicely put. Chris Berg. I'd like just to pick up on the question. It's a question for everybody, really. Would the election result have been different if Julia Gillard had not taken the Prime Ministership?
Yeah, I would be surprised. I think that the moral leadership that the party apparatchiks in the Labor Party saw Kevin Rudd had lost, I think that was a interpretation of the way he was being reflected in the electorate. I think the cancellation of his ETS plans, or at least in the short term, his failure to go to a double dissolution, I think that really dropped a lot of support out from underneath him when he'd come to the 2000 election with such a coherent and such a strong, vision for pros and cons. Kevin Rudd had a big plan for Australia. He just utterly failed to enact it. And I think that they were...
Chris. Sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there. We got through... I was living overseas during the financial crisis, living in London. All my mates in London were saying to us, how did you do that? How did you get through that with, relatively unscathed? And we did. I think it's a fantastic achievement. I think my dad should be very proud of his record. And I think that, Prime Minister Gillard should be proud of her government's record as well.
I'm obviously not convinced about some of the stimulus measures, but that's quite separate to a failure of the Rudd government to sell the fact that it had to delay the policies of 2007. It had to let them slide for a couple of years. It didn't sell that, and it quite publicly admitted that it was unable to go ahead with some of its major policies and wasn't able to stand up for that. I think that was the failure of the Rudd government, was a failure to sell its message properly.
I've got to ask you to respond to that, or
Look, I just think that that Dad should be really, really proud of what he has achieved, and I think that here we are. We've got through this horrible financial crisis relatively unscathed, and of course things had to go on the back burner. I understand that, but I've never had to run a national economy before, and I don't know about you, Chris, but I think it'd be a pretty tricky deal. What about you, Malcolm?
I wanted to say something where I think the government didn't make enough of success. The success of keeping Australia out of a deep recession, out of 10% unemployment, was because, all right, our banking system was good, there were bank guarantees, and money was got out there quickly. And all the experts, all the advice to the government, from Australia and from overseas, you've got to act quickly. Now, it's not surprising when you ask big bureaucracies, government or private, to act quickly. They're not used to it. They'll make some mistakes. Now,
let me just bring you back to the question that we were dealing with, and that was whether or not you think Julia Gillard would have done worse. I beg your pardon. It would have been better for Labor if Kevin Rudd had stayed in place.
I think if either had been able to sell the successes more, the result would have been better. And the major thing that I think they did not sell as well as they should is keeping Australia out of recession when every other Western country was deep into recession. And you had the Australian nearly every day saying, school failure, school whatever. 60% of those school failures came from the state government of New South Wales. They were all in the state systems, which were not under the direct control of the Commonwealth. They were under state departments of education. Where the Commonwealth was in control with private schools, there were virtually no complaints. And you could say, instead of highlighting failure, 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 as the Australian did, well, the independent report said 2.7% complaints, 97% success. That could have been hammered more. But beside you've got to say the insulation thing wasn't the best in the world, but nobody would try and defend that. But beside the success of keeping Australia out of a British or a French or a German or American-style recession, those failures were minuscule. And I don't think the government made anything like enough of that, either with Kevin or with Julia.
Yep, John King. A brief answer, John, because we're going to move on.
I'll be brief because I'm sitting next to the former Prime Minister's ventriloquist. I think that there are some continuities between the two. I think the tendency to strip cabinet government of its power is not a good trend in Australian politics, and they share that. But there is one area that I can think of where Kevin Rudd was sadly missed. Note the virtual absence of foreign policy discussion during the election campaign. And one of his great strengths was to build on really a trend that began with John Curtin that was given a great boost by, I would say, the 1980s Bob Hawke clever country model, and Paul Keating did it, which was to swing Australia into the Asia-Pacific region and actually to think of how Australia could insert itself in architecture building in the region. All that slipped off the agenda. And that's a very, very backward step, and I think I, for one, miss Kevin Rudd's contribution to the rethinking and consolidation of Australian foreign policy, whatever you think of it.
I was going to ask Christine Wallace to come in there as the biographer of Julia Gillard. I mean, she doesn't really have much foreign policy experience. That would explain that part of it.
Yeah, well, she's been in the job 27 seconds, so I think that's something...
Yes, and they went to an election 25 seconds later.
Well, I think her mistake was actually not calling an election the minute she walked out of the caucus room. But look, there's something that's really seriously overlooked in this election campaign, and that is, I cannot remember a Prime Minister, maybe Malcolm, you've got a longer memory and you can help me out on this, but I cannot ever remember a Prime Minister having to fight a campaign on two fronts. On the one hand, she had the Liberals coming hard at her. On the other hand, she had internal Labor rats leaking against her. Now, would Labor have been better off had they kept Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister to fight that campaign? Well, let's look at the polling. We have very high-quality polling in Australia. And all the polling showed at the end of the first week of the campaign, Labor was going to be swept back into office easily. And I remember having a coffee with a Liberal mate in Collins Street at the end of that first week, and I just totally bagged out the Liberal campaign and said, "What are you guys doing? You're hopeless. You're going to get creamed." And he agreed. He was practically slashing his wrists. Then the next week, bang, the first leak. Then bang, the second leak. And then the third week, Mark Latham behaving like a lunatic. I mean, this is what her own side was doing to her as a Prime Minister trying to win a federal election campaign. Now, Malcolm, who else? Can you remember another Australian Prime Minister caught in that kind of evil pincer movement between your political opponents on one side and your own team trying to gun you down during a federal election campaign?
It might not have been her own side on a couple of those leaks, or one of them anyway.
Well, what do you know, Malcolm? Tell us.
No, but it may not have. There were other people who knew. But one point of history, it wasn't just John Curtin or Chifley or Bob Hawke who did something about taking Australia into Asia. The foreign minister who did most for that was perhaps the most unlikely, Dick Casey. He tramped all around Asia repeatedly and often and was enormously respected. And it was Spender and Casey who began the Colombo Plan.
Okay, Malcolm, you're entitled to go back to that history because the John Curtin issue was raised, but I'm going to move us on to present day. You're watching Q&A, the program that gives you the chance to ask the questions you want answered. The next question is from Sam Fiskin.
Will the Greens holding the balance of power in the Senate and possibly the lower house pose a problem for Tony Abbott if he forms government? Ideologically, he is strongly conservative, but will he have to compromise and perhaps revert to a more classical liberal stance that you, Mr Fraser, have been an advocate for?
Is that to me?
Yes, you might as well start. You can open the batting.
One of the things the Labor Party did not do during the campaign was to highlight the extent to which Tony Abbott is capable of changing his mind on important elements of policy. The climate change policy was one of them. If he's changed it once, he can presumably change it again. Indeed, he did tell us that he doesn't always say what he means. The Labor Party didn't capitalise on that too much. I think Tony Abbott would do what he felt he needed to do to get into power or have power, if that's going to be possible. But I would like to see somebody with a deep conviction about where Australia will go and who will have some constance in terms of important policy. And that's not been demonstrated by the current Liberal Party.
Are you imagining, in all of this, are you imagining the greening of Tony Abbott?
No stranger than some of the things that might have happened.
Christine Wallace.
Whomever forms government is going to have to really rapidly get to grips with climate change policy, not least because there is a looming crisis of underinvestment in the power industry. Politicians can sit around now, but brownouts are probably only 4, 5, 6 years down the track unless there's at least a carbon price set very quickly, if not an ETS scheme set up. So whoever wins, whether it's Tony or Julia, they're going to have business banging on their door very fast, directly, as well as the Greens in the upper house pressing for real action. So, this is one thing that has to be immediately dealt with, and it shouldn't be that hard.
Chris Burke, can you imagine that kind of radical shift in Tony Abbott's core beliefs on climate change?
No, I don't think so. I think it's going to be really hard for Tony Abbott to come to any same turf with the Greens. He's a politician, and I think he'll be I think an Abbott government would be a relatively stable government, but I think it's going to be very hard for anybody on any side of politics to get through major reform under an Abbott government with a Greens Senate. I just don't see it happening.
I think it's so historically demonstrable that that's wrong. I mean, why do we have a GST in Australia? Because the Australian Democrats, the Kumbaya Party, cozied up with the Howard government and got the GST legislation through the Senate. Now, that's what happens with minority parties. They cut deals. That's what they're about. And for heaven's sake, Labor could have cut a deal with the Greens over their CPRS and didn't. They came very close. It nearly happened. But, the Greens were holding out for a better policy. And, a lot of people in Canberra, including inside the Labor Party, would behind the scenes tell you that the Greens were right.
It's not just about one man either. Don't forget that when Turnbull was there, the Liberal Party supported an ETS policy. Now, maybe the Liberals will do it again.
Remember. We do, yeah. We remember. I would say two things. One is that unlike the Democrats and their leaders, Meg Lees, who was prepared to support that GST and alienate some part of Democrats' grassroots support, I think the present Green leadership is much cleverer. And what we're likely to see, I think, with a red-green government is a continuation of a pattern that we've already been seeing for several years. The second stimulus package, the end of work choices, and the Greens bargaining for the right of parents with disabled children for support and so on. That pattern is already set, and so you can see that into the future. I cannot see the greening of Tony Abbott. Not only is climate change crap for him in his private moments, but, he says he's no Bill Gates. He doesn't seem to get, or perhaps I'm completely mistaken, some of the really fundamental details of big policies that actually, you have to have some empathy with. I don't see the evidence for this. Or is this going to be some immaculate transformation?
I think that's really unfair to Tony Abbott, to be honest. Tony Abbott did embarrassingly admit on national television that he wasn't over all the details of the NBN, and he's not a big fan of climate change action. But he was health minister for quite some time. He does know health policy very, very deeply. I have no doubt that he knows and can get up to speed with education policy. I have no doubt he can probably figure out some stuff to do with the NBN as well.
All right, Christine Wallace, want to jump in and then we'll move on.
Tony Abbott, like his political godfather John Howard, is a genuinely conservative right-wing politician in his bones. But he has learnt from John Howard to be infinitely flexible, to let no backflip go unbackflipped if it advances strategically his conservative agenda. And Tony, whatever his core right-wing beliefs are, has had a number of notable high-profile policy reversals on key issues. And you wait, it will happen on green policy. He will cut a deal. There has to be a deal. Business wants it. The Senate wants it. It's going to happen.
All right, no, hang on. I'm going to cut in there because we've got a few questions to get through. Our next one comes from Scott McLeod.
Mr. Fraser, you recently stated to ABC Radio that you do not believe the coalition is ready to govern. Do you really think that an infighting Labor Party, which you previously described on Q&A as worse than Whitlam, is better at governing than an opposition who has had half its shadow ministry as successful ministers of the Howard government?
It was only one part of the policy that was worse than Mr. Whitlam, by no means the totality of whatever the government had done. I'm not sure how much stability there is in either of the parties. There's certainly a great yearning amongst both parties for a different approach, a broader approach, one that has some vision for the future of Australia, and one which really tackles difficult issues and is prepared to explain those issues and not respond to focus groups or today's polls or to pressure from News Corporation. And do you think that's funny? Just look at the paper, read that paper, and read all their papers, and see where their pressures come and where their purposes and objectives lie. Not just in Australia, but in the United States, their attacks on Obama, and in Britain also.
You've had a chance to see Tony Abbott a little more in recent days and through the campaign. Do you think Tony Abbott and the coalition are ready to rule government now?
Well, I don't see anyone really ready to rule at the moment.
What would it take to get you back to the Liberal Party?
Well, it's a different world. Gladstone was Prime Minister for the fourth time at the age of 84, and I'm only 80. But the pace of life was a little different then. And I believe the Liberal Party has passed beyond the core Liberal beliefs which were central to the party when Menzies founded the party. And let me just give you one example. When the party was founded, politicians were to be totally removed from raising money to support the party. Other people, organisation people, could do that. And that prevailed probably mostly until the middle 80s. Not always, certainly always in his time, and I believe in my time. Now, as I understand it, I'm told people are given quotas of money to raise. One person told me, if I don't raise a certain quota, my pre-selection will be affected. Well, this has infected both parties. It is not a basic Liberal value when politicians have to go and raise funds upon which they support or re-support their re-election, their pre-selection will be dependent. It should be dependent on the values, the idea they have for Australia and where Australia will go.
All right. We've got time for... Thank you. We're fast running out of time. We have time just for a quick run around with a final question that comes from Natalia Antelak-Supper.
Independent MP Rob Oakeshott has called for a mix-and-match government, indicating a move away from the traditional structure of Parliament. Is this genuinely a feasible idea, or are there better suited proposals for parliamentary reform? Thank you.
All right, we've got a time for a short answer from everybody, and I'll start with Mr. Keane.
Well, it was Edmund Burke who said that every government is based or ought to be based on compromise and barter. In democracies, that mix and match model usually works under crisis conditions. I don't think we're in those conditions. And I don't think that particular call by Mr. Oakeshott should be read so literally. It's quite possible that it's a call for his own appointment to a cabinet portfolio, which might not be such a bad thing, by the way. It might be the price of a compromise. But I don't think we're going through a period where we're seeing the self-dissolution of two major parties. That's not what's happening. Okay. We're trying to form, I think, this week, some kind of charter of good government for the country. And that will involve, as it is now, heavy bargaining and a deal that sticks.
All right, short answers from everybody. Chris.
Yeah, I heard that and I thought it was absurd. I mean, the corollary of consensus government is that you really have no opposition. Rob Oakeshott is talking about some pretty substantial policy reforms. I hope that at least somebody opposes them for some reason, and I don't want to see that lost.
Christine.
Yes, I'd like Julia to pick up the phone right now to Malcolm Turnbull and say, look, you accidentally got lost in the wrong party. Come over now. EDS, we'll do it with you.
Malcolm Turnbull, can you see Malcolm Fraser? I did this to you once before, didn't I? Malcolm Fraser, can you see Malcolm Turnbull becoming an independent, shifting sides?
No, I can't. But he is a Liberal.
No, he's not. He's a Labor man.
Well, I was going to say he was a traditional... I meant he was a traditional Liberal, and that was one of the reasons why he was removed, because there were people in the Liberal Party who did not, in my view, want a real Liberal to rule and shape the future of the Liberal Party.
Okay. Final quick answer from Jessica.
Well, I have great hope that our national leaders will figure it out, and if they don't, we can punish them next time round.
Okay, we've run out of time. Please thank Chris Berg, Christine Wallace, Malcolm Fraser, Jessica Rudd and John Keane. Okay. Well, there's no guarantee we'll have a stable government by next Monday, but we can guarantee you a Q&A with the former Queensland Premier Peter Beattie, social researcher Rebecca Huntley and America's leading analyst of redneck politics, Joe Badgett. Until Monday night, we'll see you then. Good night.